into the fray. Here we go. This is the general calling into the battle. As we come to Colossians chapter 2 and how we get to verse 16, we come to that place in this great letter where Paul will now turn and address specifically and directly the issues at the church in Colossae. Everything up to this point has been Paul preparing to address specifically what it is that is taking place there in Colossae. It's been laying the groundwork for what he wants to say about the church specifically. He's told us about who Jesus is. Specifically, he has presented the nature of Jesus as the head of the church. He is the head of this great body to which the church of Colossae belonged. He also spoke of his great struggle, of course, as an apostle to go and preach the gospel, assuring that everyone who hears it is mature in that gospel. And then he gives to us an imperative to walk in him, that is, walk in Christ, knowing who he is and knowing who they are, as those who have been circumcised with a circumcision without hands, who've been baptized into his body, who've been raised in newness of life. Everything that the Colossian believers needed to be reminded of in the church. Who is the head of this thing called the church? How does Paul himself view the importance and nature and purpose of the church, even as he presents the gospel? What does it mean to be a follower of Christ? What does it mean to walk in him? All those things he's put before us to get us to this place. Now, let's go. Let's talk about what's really going on at Colossae. So what we're about to look at is what I would call a set of negative imperatives. Okay, so this is reverse imperatives. They're directed specifically at the issues in the Colossian church. So Paul is going to take that phrase, walk in him, 1:6, and he's going to turn it around. He's going to negate it. And he's going to push it against the heterodox views of those at Colossae, you see. So he's going to take this whole walk in him and turn it upside down. In other words, here's what walk in him does not mean, as others would have you to think. See, they want you to walk in him, quote unquote, differently than I do, Paul says. I want to tell you what walk in him means against what they say. So, chapter 2, verse 6, listen. Therefore, as you received Christ, I'm sorry, I'm in the wrong verse. Where am I? 16, not 6, 16. We already covered all that. 16. Therefore, let no one pass judgment on you in questions of food and drink, or with regard to a festival, or a new moon, or a Sabbath. These are a shadow of the things to come, but the substance belongs to Christ. Let no one disqualify you, insisting on asceticism and worship of angels, going on in detail about visions, puffed up without reason by his sensuous mind, and not holding fast to the head, from whom the whole body, nourished and knit together through its joints and ligaments, grows with a growth that is from God. If with Christ you died to the elemental spirits of the world, why, as if you're still alive in the world, do you submit to regulations? Do not handle, do not taste, do not touch. Referring to things that all perish as they're used, according to human precepts and teachings. These have indeed an appearance of wisdom in promoting self-made religion and asceticism and severity to the body, but they're of no value in stopping the indulgence of the flesh. Now, you will notice as I read those that there's a phrase that appears twice. It appears in verse 16. It appears again in verse 18. Let no one. Let no one. Now, I would say that it's also implied in verse 20. In 16 it's implied, in 18 and 16 it's stated, 18 it's stated, and 20 it's implied. Paul is going to say, let no one pass judgment on you in regards to various religious rituals and practices, what religious practices they think you should or shouldn't be embracing. Don't let anyone do that. Let not anyone disqualify you from being a justified follower of Christ based on their cultish practices of piety that they should or should not be characteristic of you. And then finally, let no one force you to submit to legalisms or formalisms, what they think is needed to complete your status as a Christian, especially in the whole area of personal growth. Okay? Let no one. Now, the first question that we really need to ask and answer is, okay, who's the no one he's talking about here, right? Who is this supposed no one? Let no one do this. Can we glean from this text what kind of men that Paul is addressing, or what kind of man Paul is addressing here? Or we could say it like this: who has come to Colossae with his brand of Christianity and is forcing it upon the Colossian church? Who is this one? Now, more than likely, this individual has been reported to Paul by Epaphras. We remember in chapter 1, verse 7, he's mentioned again in chapter 4 and verse 13. Who is this one that Epaphras has come to Paul and told him about, who has come to the church at Colossae and is pushing a form of Christianity? Who is it? Well, I gave you an answer to this question actually at the beginning of this sermon series in the introduction, so let me just refresh your memory. There are some who read the book of Colossians and assert that Paul is addressing a form of proto-Gnosticism, an early form of Gnosticism, which appeared in the church. We see it particularly in 1st through 3rd John. We addressed it when we looked at those letters. But the problem with that is that even as we studied Paul's understanding of Jesus earlier in chapter 1, he does not really, in those verses, attack the Gnostic ideas of Jesus that were promulgated a little later in the life of the church. He simply comes and expresses who Jesus is. He doesn't really address the Gnostic tendency of thinking of Jesus as just sort of a man without any divinity who had power. He doesn't do that. He comes straight to the point of who he is. So it is unlikely that Paul is addressing some sort of proto-Gnosticism that's risen up in the church. And as I pointed out in my introduction sermon, Gnosticism as a movement really didn't start until you get into the 2nd century. So this is probably far too early for that kind of thinking. A more likely problem, however, is that the church in Colossae was struggling with some sort of Jewish mysticism. Some sort of Jewish mysticism. You might say it's a mysticism of Christians, let's put that in quotes, engaging in various ascetic practices, promoting some sort of what looks like angel worship or spirit worship, all for the benefit of getting close to God. Now, this would not have been outside the realm of what was real in the 1st century. Mysticism is the belief that union with the deity, or becoming one with God, or being absorbed into the deity in some sense where you become deified, or some sort of apprehension of spiritual knowledge that's inaccessible to the common man. Now that would be Gnostic, but it's mystic as well. Some idea that you can know God, more than the average person can know God. You can know God. So you can have some sort of experience, some experiential connection to the deity. And you can do this, you can achieve this through some sort of contemplation and or self-surrender. And it's often associated with the supernatural and quite often with the occult. It's this idea that I can become one with God. I can become one with the nature of God, and I can do that by contemplating and self-surrenders and various sorts of practices which will raise me to a new level of consciousness and existence, kind of like the old transcendental meditation where I can meditate my way into a state in which I become like God or I get to know God closer. That's mysticism. It's very prominent in the East. Eastern mysticisms are extraordinarily prominent in those religions. It's the idea of becoming one with God with some sort of spiritual ecstasy brought on by religious practices or self-sacrifice. Living in a cave or living in a monastery or fasting or some sort of frenzied activity like prayer or whatever. It's these forms of outward actions and activities that are designed to help you to come into contact with God. Now, in this case, I think it has Jewish overtones, strong Jewish overtones. So it seems that what Paul is dealing with here is some sort of shaman-like rabbi, some sort of Jewish rabbi who comes with these mystical practices. We call it a shaman, who comes with these sets of behaviors, these pieties, and they incorporate various pagan rituals for some sort of heightened value. Notice the nature in verse 16 of what Paul speaks of. Everything in the list is Jewish. He speaks of food and drink, festivals, new moons, and more specifically, Sabbaths. And so all of those things are clearly Jewish in nature. So it appears that whoever is coming is bringing some sort of Jewish reality to this. And if you combine that with the fact that Paul uses a personal pronoun in verse 18, at the end of verse 18, puffed up without reason by his sensuous mind, leads many, including me, to believe that this is some individual, some person. And this is usually how it goes, right? There's usually some person who comes sort of leading this process, right? And so here you have some sort of religious man, some sort of shaman-like rabbi with Jewish background, and he comes to the church at Colossae, and he comes placing his own teachings into the church, and he places them above the true gospel, and he makes certain pieties a part of the very fabric of the church itself. Here's the practices that you need to do. Here's what we need to do as Christians in order to grow closer to God and come to a deeper understanding of these sorts of things. So what I think you see here is some sort of individual, a Jewish shaman, promoting a form of mysticism in which the Christian embraces pietistic forms of Judaism with heightened awareness, bringing one closer to God. And there's plenty of anecdotal evidence to suggest that this was popular in the first century. Even before Gnosticism took hold, this sort of thing was there. You remember the constant struggle that Paul had with forms of Judaism in the church that were coming in and trying to convince believers to practice Jewish things. The first ecumenical council in Acts 15, what was it all about? Okay, it's about Gentiles having to be circumcised in order to be a part of the church. It's a very similar kind of thing. But in this case, it appears to be some sort of practice beyond just typical Jewish practices. There's a mysticism here. Okay? And we're going to see that most specifically in verse 18 when we start talking about asceticisms and worship of angels and so forth. So Paul is going to give us three different let no one, and implied let no one come to you and tell you these things. So he's addressing directly what's taking place here. And he starts by saying, look, let no one pass judgment on you in questions of ... Now, this word pass judgment is actually simply the word for judgment itself in the Greek. It means to evaluate, it means to decide, it means to judge, it means to pronounce between multiple positions, etc. It's to make a determination of something as being acceptable or not. To evaluate between two positions and make a decision as to which is right. The word is used 115 times in the New Testament. So it's all over the place, judgment. But it has a number of different nuances. One in particular that this particular word is used is found in Matthew chapter 7, verse 1 in the King James, probably the most famous use of this word. Judge not, lest ye be judged, right? That's the most famous use of this particular word. It's obviously Jesus saying, contra to so many how they interpret it, it's clearly Jesus saying, the standard by which you evaluate others will be the standard by which you are evaluated. So whatever standard you want to impose upon someone else, fine, but just be aware that that's what they're going to impose back on you. All right? Now, the fact of the matter is, and this goes against those who would want to use this phrase as, don't make any moral judgments against me. The common reality is that we have to make judgments all the time. We have to make judgments all the time. We have to evaluate. We have to decide. We have to make choices between this or that. We have to make pronouncements of what is the right and what is the wrong. It's a common reality in the human experience. All life is a form of judgment, in a sense, in which we are evaluating various opinions, choices, options, directions, attitudes, and yes, even moral positions. We're doing that constantly. We're making judgments of one thing being better than another. We make judgments when we choose certain foods to eat. I like this, I'm not particularly fond of that. You know? I'm a big fan of green peas. I can't stand Brussels sprouts. I'm making a judgment. I know, judge not, lest ye be judged, right? Judgment is necessary. Deciding, making choices, choosing options is necessary for navigating the path of life. You will make tens of thousands of judgments over the course of the next 24 hours. You will choose all kinds of things. And you will have choices. You will have options. I can go this way, I can go that way. Even as we may apply judgment to the actions or beliefs of others. So we're going to make choices not only for ourselves, but we're going to make choices in terms of, or make judgments in terms of others. If you are a parent, for example, you are going to judge whether the behavior of your child is right or wrong in accordance with your own standards that you've established. The child may say to his mother, judge not, lest ye be judged, but the mother says, but I'm the mom. We are making judgments about our own lives, and we are making judgments about others all the time. In fact, would it not be true that it is necessary for us to judge even the spiritual condition of others in order to evangelize them, don't you think? To present the gospel to another, we are making an assertion and a judgment that they need to hear the message of the gospel, that they're lost. Probably the great example here is that even though Jesus says in Matthew 7:1, judge not lest ye be judged, just 5 verses later he says, do not cast your pearls before swine. And guess what you're going to have to do? You're going to have to decide who's the swine before you don't cast your pearls before them. So judgment in and of itself is not a bad thing. It's a normal part of the human existence. Now we know, of course, that the ultimate form of judgment, when all men stand before God and are judged, that is an extension of that reality. But Paul is using the word here in the reverse. Paul's using the term here in the reverse. Do not let others judge you. Which Paul is implying, then, is a form of invalid judgment that comes against you by others. Do not let anybody cast some judgment upon you. But what would be the basis of him saying, don't let them judge you? Answer, Their standard is wrong. The measure of what they are using to make such a judgment is wrong. Now, that would be, in essence, of what Jesus is saying when he says, judge not lest you be judged, right? Pluck the log out of your own eye before you try to pluck the speck out of someone else's eye, is make sure that you are making judgments on the correct basis. Know what the basis is and make the correct judgment based on those bases. In this case, Paul is saying, and don't let others judge you against a standard that is wrong. That's where he's going here. It's a faulty judgment. It's an evaluation of you by others that is wrong or based on faulty assumptions or conclusions. Someone coming to you and asserting that you should be or must be or doing something or thinking something based on a standard that they have established, which is wrong or invalid. It's clear, isn't it? Do not let no one pass judgment on you in these matters, because they're setting a standard that is wrong. So when Paul says, let no one judge you, he is saying, don't let someone come and tell you what you ought to do or think on the basis of their standard, which is wrong. It's really expressed, I think, best in Paul's writings in Romans 14:3. When Paul says, let not the one who eats despise the one who abstains, and let not the one who abstains pass judgment, there's the word, on the one who eats, for God has welcomed him. Paul says, those of you who are comfortable eating that which has been sacrificed to idols in the temple, go ahead. Those of you who are uncomfortable with that, okay, don't. But don't pass judgment on each other based on your particular standard, because God has welcomed both of them. It's wrong for anyone to prohibit something in another that has not been prohibited by God. Now, you could also reverse that. It's also wrong for someone to insist that you must be doing something on the basis of something that God doesn't insist that you ought to be doing. So it's two sides of the same coin. That would be a faulty judgment. Well, I think you should do this or that. Well, see, I just gave you the clue as to why it's wrong. Because I think. So this would be the faulty judgment that Paul is referring to here, and applying a human standard outside of the divine one. Taking a human standard and applying it to a situation when the divine standard doesn't go there. In other words, do not let others insist for you what is right based on their faulty assumptions. Do not allow that to happen. Now, I do want to put a caveat here. There is a correct way of passing judgment. As I said earlier, that's what we do. We do pass judgment. And so by definition, if there is an incorrect way to pass judgment, there must be a correct one. There must be a correct way to tell others that their behaviors or their thought process or their beliefs are wrong. Pronouncing others to be wrong when their belief or behavior is clearly outside of what God has pronounced to be wrong. If God has declared it to be wrong, it is wrong. It is not really a judgment of ours to say to a man, your thinking or behavior in contradistinction to what God has said is wrong. That's not really a judgment. That's simply a statement of fact. We must be careful that we do not attempt to pass judgment or to receive judgment even when our position or their position is wrong, but we should be willing to accept judgment when the position is based on the correct and right standard. Let me give you an example, a contra-example here that might help. There's a new idea floating around in American culture that we should be listening to each other. We should be listening to each other. And when I say that we should be listening to each other, that means we should be listening and affirming what we are saying. So when I speak of something, you need to listen, but it isn't just you listening, it's you affirming what I say. If I listen to you and truly hear what you are saying, even to be corrected when appropriate, but still understand that what you are believing to be contrary to the revealed word, then I am, in fact, appropriately judging you when I still say you're wrong. See, there's many today who want you to just listen. And if you listen, then you'll understand and you won't pass judgment, you see. You'll just affirm what I say to be true. But what if I listen and you're still wrong? What if I hear what you're saying and still recognize that what you're saying is wrong? See, the modern idea is, oh no, you can't go there. See, you have to listen to me, and then when you listen to me, then you can understand what I'm thinking, and then you can affirm what I'm saying, even if I'm wrong. I think Chip Gaines stepped into it in this, thinking, you see, you Christians ought to just listen. You see, if you would just listen, if you would just hear and understand what we're saying, then you would affirm what we're saying, and you wouldn't have such a problem with what we're doing. But what if I listen and you're still wrong? I mean, what if I literally give you a hearing and hear you and listen and even agree with some of the things you say and then turn around and say, but you're still wrong? See, our modern culture would say, well, you don't go there. You just affirm what I said to be true. But a biblical idea of judgment would be, well, I've listened to you, and what you are saying violates God's word, so I'm still going to call your position wrong. I've listened to it. See, here's where the danger lies, and listen, hear me. There have been countless people who have fallen into this danger right here, where they have listened and even empathized with others' sinful beliefs and behaviors, which has caused them to embrace their sinfulness rather than calling it out. I mean, even in Romans chapter 1, verse 32, they do all these wicked things and they want others to affirm what they're doing. The danger is to allow someone to come and emotionally manipulate you by virtue of having you listen and empathize with their position, such as then that you affirm their sinfulness. But a proper judgment would be to give them a hearing. All right, tell me what you believe, and then to say, wait, what you believe is still sinful. I'm not going to embrace what you believe simply because of an emotional connection that we have. I mean, how many well-known preachers have we seen who have embraced LGBTQ ... positions simply because they have encountered someone in their own families who has fallen into these sins? Well, I want to love my son. You know, he's come out, and I want to still love him. So you know what? I'm simply going to change my theology so that I don't look like I don't love him. That's the danger that Paul is really referring to here. We are called to make judgments. We're not to allow others to use their wrong positions to change our positions. That's what Paul is saying here. Don't let somebody come to you with their wrong understandings and change the way that you believe. Because in essence, what Paul has said is, because I have just spent half this letter telling you what you should believe, don't let anybody come to you with their emotionalism and change it. Let no one pass judgment on you. So Paul is clearly using this phrase against those who would come against the believers in the Colossian church with their self-righteous set of standards. Not ones based on the centrality and nature of Christ, and certainly not ones based on what it means to be a true follower of Christ, but upon just their opinions of what we ought to do and believe and practice. This is not just a danger in the first century. It's a danger in the 21st century. And let me suggest that our culture is doing everything it can to change your beliefs through emotionalism. That's what it's doing. And every social media feed you look at is doing it. Now, what's the substance then of these judgments? What were these men coming and saying to the Colossians in terms of what they ought to be doing? And Paul starts with food and drink. The kinds of things that Christians, their definition, should or should not eat or drink in order to maintain a proper form of piety before the world. Now, when I use the word piety, what I mean by that is fidelity to religious obligations. Your piety is doing that which your religious system requires you to do. There are good pieties and there are evil pieties. There's good pieties in which we gather together as the people of God and we sing and we pray and we hear the scriptures read and preached. Those are good pieties because that's what God has commanded for us to do in His Word. But then there are evil pieties, which are things that you are supposed to go out there for and say, but we're going to do this and not do this, and we're not going to do this, and we're not going to do this, and we're going to make sure that everybody else follows our understandings, even though the Word never says anything about it. So it's obligations or devoutness. Typically outward practices that are designed to reflect one's inner devotion. But more often than not, it's doing before others to show one's belief. Doing before others what you want them to believe you are. Very often. Much religion is based on the idea of show. I want to make sure that you know that I'm a good such and such by the things that I do, even though they mean really very little to me. I think we discovered a couple of guys in Pilgrim's Progress not too long ago, formalist and hypocrisy, who are exactly that. There's an example in 1 Corinthians 10:25, the insistence by some at Corinth that eating meat that had been offered to temple idols would taint it, thereby spoiling the Christian witness. Don't let your pieties, don't eat the stuff from the market that might have been offered to an idol because that'll show that you're not really a Christian. Paul goes, what? So there are pieties that are fine. There are outflows of true righteousness. The pieties that are wrong are those that promote only outward show. Hypocrisy. Outward, but nothing on the inward, right? Whitewashed tombs. Pretty on the outside, but full of dead men's bones on the inside. So I think what we have here then in this instance is an insistence by this individual, this shaman, this religious Jewish shaman, that Christians must only eat or drink certain things in order to show their Christian or religious sense to the world, some sort of outward discipline in terms of what you eat or what you don't eat. Again, notice how common this is to Judaism. But then Paul moves to two words which go together, festival or a new moon, which is, in this case now, moving from which you eat and drink to the kinds of celebrations that you participate in, various Jewish observances that are outlined in the ceremonial code. You remember that the law of God in the Old Testament is divided into three categories. You have the moral code, which is the Decalogue undergirding all of the rest of the law, and then two great pillars standing on top of it, the ceremonial law and the civil law. The civil law being all the laws relating to you and your brother in living together, and then the ceremonial code, all the stuff related to how you worship God. The civil code being the horizontal laws, the ceremonial code being the vertical laws, all built on the foundation of the moral code. So in this case, it's various feasts and festivals and celebrations and other kinds of things that are all documented in the ceremonial code. Feast days scattered throughout the Jewish calendar, for example, the various festivals like Passover, unleavened bread, first fruits, the festival of weeks, the festival of trumpets, the festival of booths, the Day of Atonement. There's a whole bunch of them in the ceremonial code that are put there for the people of Israel to celebrate. New moon is a word in the Greek that literally means new month. Okay, it means new month, but it's translated as new moon because it's the idea of, okay, when the lunar calendar begins a new month, and you remember the Jews used the lunar calendar, and so they would, each new month, they had certain festivals and feasts that they had to do at the beginning of each month. They had certain sacrifices, burnt offerings, drink offerings that they had to make. They're outlined in Numbers 28:11 and following. So what Paul is referring to here then is someone coming along and insisting that you must participate in these various ceremonial celebrations in order to be a Christian. So food and drink, certain things you can eat and not eat, certain things you can drink and not drink, and then on top of that, the various festivals that you need to participate in. Again, these are all very Jewish in nature, which is why I believe that whoever this is some sort of religious rabbi, a shaman of some sort who has a Jewish background. But then Paul speaks of not only a festival or new moon or a Sabbath. Now it's translated singularly in most English Bibles, even though the word is plural in the Greek. I'm not exactly sure why it isn't translated Sabbaths. It should be. So there's probably here what Paul is referring to are various specialty Sabbath celebrations that are outlined in the ceremonial code. Again, given that the word is plural, Paul is probably meaning some reference to unique Sabbath celebrations in distinction to the regular Sabbath practices outlined in the fourth commandment. And there were 4 specific Sabbats that were a part of the Jewish calendar each year. There were 2 at Passover and 2 at Purim. So it's possible that Paul is referring to these sort of things. So this is probably not Paul addressing the later, much later debate about Saturday or Sunday Sabbath worship. That's not what Paul is going after here. That would be a much later issue that would be dealt with. More likely, it's dealing with the insistence on those who would say that you have to celebrate these various Sabbaths like the Jews do. So you got to celebrate the Sabbats associated with Passover and the Sabbats associated with Purim. Now, I'm convinced that Paul undoubtedly considered Sabbath worship intrinsic to Christian behavior. I don't think there's any way around that from Paul's perspective. He's not saying here that celebrating the Sabbath is wrong. I think that's why he uses the plural here. He's saying there are certain kinds of Sabbaths that would be wrong. I think he believed the fourth commandment would still be in effect, given the fact that the moral code is still in effect. The moral code, which undergirds the civil and ceremonial laws, doesn't go away just because the pillars standing on top of it do. The moral code transcends the people of Israel to cover the entirety of the earth because it's built into the very nature of humanity and it's part of the very character of God himself. Paul himself, you remember, even referenced the Sabbath in his day as the first day of the week, 1 Corinthians 16:2. So he had an idea that there was a gathering that was to be the people of God coming together to celebrate the reality of worship. It's what we are called to do in the Sabbath because it's a universal law established in the commandments. His instructions here are probably those having to do with Jewish additions to Sabbath operations that are coming through this religious shaman who is saying, yes, we celebrate, we come together and worship on Sunday, but we got all these other observances we need to do as well. So I'm convinced that Paul is speaking here of various kinds of Jewish practices that the rabbi, quote unquote, who has come to Colossae is insisting on amongst the people that are in the church. He's got strong judgments, if you will, of what they are supposed to be doing. And he probably is saying that practicing these is essential to being a true Christian. And failing to do so brings judgment. We are judging you if you don't do these things. And Paul says, do not let others evaluate you as a follower of Christ on the basis of your participation in various rituals or practices, in this case Jewish, ones which they think you should be doing. And why not? Because he just spent several verses telling you what you are. You are a follower of Christ on the basis of the fact that you've been born again by the Spirit of God. You've been baptized into a new life in Christ. You've been circumcised with a circumcision not made with hands. You have been raised to walk in a new life. That is what defines you as a Christian, not your participation in these various rituals. In other words, the faulty belief undergirding the judgment here, and the reason why it can be rejected, the faulty belief is that outward practices are intrinsic to what it means to be something. And have we not spent like a year saying the exact opposite of that? You are not any of these things by the things that you do. These men come and say, well, you're a Christian if you do these things. That's a faulty assumption, which leads to a faulty judgment, which we can reject because it's based on a faulty premise. Now, Paul says in verse 17, these, okay, what? Food and drink, or various restrictions regarding food and drink, festivals, new moon, Sabbath. These are a shadow of the things to come, but the substance belongs to Christ. So here's what Paul is going to say. Here's the reality of what these men are doing. Let me make sure you understand that when these people are imposing something on you, here's what they're really doing. I want you to think about what these things are and then get the connection to why you can say to them, Now, when he says that they're a shadow of the things to come, let's look at this word, okay? The word shadow. You think of a shadow. Everybody knows what a shadow is, right? Shadow is the darkness that's cast by an object deflected from a light source. Okay, that's the technical definition, right? It's the image that's cast by that deflected light upon the ground or upon the wall. You can look at the shadow and you can discern the thing that's casting the shadow. There's too many lights pointing too many different directions. I got like 30 shadows up here. But you know, there's something. If you're standing outside on a sunny day and you look down, you see your shadow on the ground. It's an image of you that's cast on the ground by deflected light from you. And that darkness, if you will, that cast points to you because you are the object that's casting it. And so it follows. If you follow the shadow, it will lead to its source. Right? So if you're standing there and you see a shadow of a tree, you follow the shadow of the trunk, it'll lead you to the tree. So the shadow points to something. But the shadow is not the something. It's not the something. It's just something being cast that points to it. So when Paul says that these things are but a shadow of the things to come, he is saying that the various rituals mentioned above only point to something else. They themselves are not the substance. They're not the reality of it. They're not literally the body. When Paul says these are a shadow of the things to come, the word he uses is the word for flesh here, sarx. It's not the body. It's like when your shadow is not you. Your shadow is just deflected light on the ground. It's not the real thing. So when Paul says these things are but a shadow, what he means is that they were shadowy pointers to the real thing. So what's the real thing? The Jewish festivals, new moons, and Sabbath celebrations are only foreshadowings. See how I use the word there? Foreshadowings of the coming of the Christ. They point to him. He casts the shadow, which is the various food and drink requirements and regulations, Sabbath days, etc. They point forward to him as the fulfillment of God's promises. They are but foreshadowings of a promise of a greater thing yet to come. I'll give you some examples. We'll take a festival. Okay, we'll take a Sabbath. How about Passover? Probably the single greatest celebration in Judaism, the Passover. The celebration, you remember, in Egypt, that the angel of death would pass over the households of those with blood of the lamb on the doorposts and lintels, right? But it's a foreshadowing. In and of itself, it does not save, but it points forward to the passing over of the sins of an elect people by the blood of Christ shed on the cross. We can look back through the cross and go, oh, that's what the Passover was all about. God sent another lamb, this case the Lamb of God, to come, to be slain, and his blood is written on the doorposts and lintels of our hearts, and the Lord passes over with his angel of death those who possess that blood. It's a foreshadowing of the greater thing. I mean, think about it. The Israelites had to celebrate the Passover every year. But once Christ comes, he becomes the Passover lamb, which satisfies the fullness of the wrath of God, such that it is finished. No more need to go and kill lambs and spread blood on doorposts and lintels anymore, because Christ has come. Another example, how about the priesthood? Of the priesthood. You know, all those priests that lived and died. We've talked about a few of them in our reading of 1st and 2nd Kings. These are the men that were set aside from the line of Levi to mediate between God and the people in the temple, offering sacrifices to atone for their sins. But the writer of Hebrews makes it clear in his writing that they were unsuccessful. And for a number of reasons. Number one, they couldn't offer a perfect sacrifice. Number two, they couldn't offer it in the perfect tabernacle. And number three, they kept dying off. They couldn't continue the work. You had to have a new priest every once in a while because the last one died. It's a foreshadowing, however, of a true priest, a true mediator. In fact, the God-man himself, who will come and stand between fallen men and a holy God and establish a perfect sacrifice and make an absolute atonement for men, a completed, finished atonement, and he will do it in the very presence of God himself. The priests in the temple of the Old Testament were just a foreshadowing of the far greater priest who would come, and he would come, even as the writer of Hebrews tells us, from a very different line of priests, a perfect line of priests. Or, how about the Sabbath? The Sabbath is a foreshadowing. The Old Testament Sabbath celebrations and even the seventh-day celebrations where you remember a commemoration of the day established by God, a day of rest established by God in a fallen and cursed world. But it foreshadows a day when a true rest comes in the finished work of Christ. We toil 6 days a week. And our toil is designed quite literally to drive us back into the dust of the ground from which we came. We are cursed to toil the ground, and the ground will eventually win and have its way. We set aside one day each week in order to rest from that work. But what we need is an eternal rest that comes when Christ brings finality to the curse of death and gives us life real life. And so the Old Testament Sabbath celebrations were simply pointing forward to a day when finally we have rest from the curse and from the toil that just leads us back to the ground. In fact, we as Baptists have written into our confession, the 1689 confession, that Sunday is the Lord's Day. We call it that in the confession. We call it the Lord's Day. And it's not purely just a continuation of the Old Testament Sabbaths. It's a commemoration of the true day of rest that's inaugurated in the resurrection. We celebrate this day on this day, Sunday, the first day of the week, because the resurrection is our day of rest. It's our day of true Sabbath, when all of what God had purposed to do in resting on the seventh day of his creative work is finished in his redemptive work. And one day when we are raised, we will have that true rest. This, what we're doing this morning, is but a celebration of what is to come. Anticipation of that. Our belief, yes, we have rest in him. So we are told by the apostle, do not let others pass judgment on you for not embracing the religious obligations of the law, because you know that they are but shadows of the finished work of Christ. Don't let this religious shaman tell you that you need to go back to certain festivals and food and drink regulations and such things, because that's what you need to be a Christian. Why? Because you know better. Because you know better. Because when the Spirit circumcised you with a new circumcision of the heart, when he raised you from the dead, which you identify in baptism, and you come forth to walk in new life, you now know something. And here's what you know. You know that those things are all finished in the work of Christ. So guess what? I don't need your celebrations. I've got Christ. He is the fulfillment of those things. Don't you come and tell me that my behaviors need to conform to your religious mysticisms and pieties, because I know that they are nothing but shadows of the real thing. This is the mistake I think far too many Christians make. They get drawn into religious practices because the hucksters out there will tell you, you need to be doing these things in order to be a Christian. And Paul is saying, you know better. You know who he is and what he did. Don't get drawn back into that. Don't be taken captive by those who would impose their religion upon you. The deceitful, the empty deceits and philosophies, remember? You know what it means to walk in him, having been raised from the dead. You know that these things are only shadowy forms pointing to the one who has given you what you truly need. You have been declared holy by God by faith in his Son. We call that justification. That's what you've got. Why do you need more justification if it's already been done?